Now we're going to pop back up to that dial, to what is more traditionally thought of as shooting modes, not necessarily scenes. Scenes are like they sound. They're like, hey, I'm at the beach. What settings should I use? I don't know. You can see if you have a beach scene. You probably do. If you're going snorkeling and you're like, ooh, what should I do underwater? That's tough. I don't know. You might have a snorkel mode. I'm not kidding. It's probably in there. So there's all kinds of scenes. So now we'll go back to the shooting modes. They're a little bit less colorful and a little more like straightforward. So on the dials, you probably have something that is either labeled with a TV or an S, depending on your make and model. But it's the same thing. The TV stands for time variable because in shutter, the shutter speed controls time, right? In the photo, it's what determines how much time you're photographing. So TV does not stand for television. It's time variable. The S then stands for shutter. So in this mode, it's called shutter priority, and what that means is you are choosing the shutter speed and the camera's doing everything else. Awesome, right? That is a great place to hang out if you are caring about your shutter speed, if you're trying to do a long exposure or you really need to make sure you have a fast exposure. Be in shutter priority mode. Don't worry about the rest. So the camera will you'll nail that down, nail down the shutter speed that you want, and then the camera will balance out the rest of that wobbling triangle. So that's really useful. Like here's an example where, so this is a slower shutter speed. I wanted to capture some motion blur. This is also with that point and shoot that I drag around with me everywhere. But this is a little bit of a newer one. The older one finally bit the dust. So the point and shoot, it has manual mode, but it's not as convenient to work it as it is on like a DSLR. So I had this in shutter priority, and I played around until I found a shutter speed that gave me a good mix of motion and blur. And then, the camera would deal with the rest. Great, super easy. Sometimes, I will just point out, I always like to mention it when I show this image. In photography and in life, there are limits to things, right? Sometimes we just think anything should be possible at any moment, at any given second, just because we want it. It should just be that way. And it's a lesson to be reminded that it's not. So, for example, when we shot this photo, we were having some Moroccan mint tea on this balcony, and nightfall was coming. And I had been trying to get this longer exposure, but it was really bright out there. And this little point and shoot, in the maximum aperture that it has, is f8, which is not very squinty, right? That's like half of what my DSLR lenses can do. So it was way too bright to have a 2-second exposure. Even with the lowest ISO, even with the squintiest aperture, if I made the shutter speed too bright, it was too much light. So we had to hang out and drink more Moroccan mint teas and spend all this time just like chilling, relaxing, until it started to get dark enough that I could pull off the shot. So I just say that because I think it's a good reminder that sometimes, you do run into, and I knew when I bought that camera that it only could squint down to f8. And I was choosing between this one and a different one that had a built-in neutral density filter, which is like sunglasses for your camera. And I was like, oh, am I gonna want that? I don't know. But I chose this one, and I knew this would be a limitation, and I just ran right up into that wall. And thankfully, the wall came with Moroccan mint teas, and we could just chill for a bit. But it does happen. Yes, Jose?
I noticed in the picture you get little starburst around the lights.
What's that all about?
Yeah, how did
that happen? Yeah, so some of the light points have these little starbursts. That is a function of squinty apertures. So if you take pictures of light sources like that, points of light, with a squinty aperture, you can get that effect. That does not happen at f8 on my DSLR camera, I will say. So it's all about the optics of the lens and your camera, but on my point and shoot, it's a thing that happens. It was in that other photo too of the Trafalgar Square. It was the same thing, but yeah. So, and you can do that like with my DSLR. I've actually shot like to get the sun to do that. If I shoot it at f/22, I can get that starburst from the sun too. So yeah, all these funny little tricks is really cool, right? So you can also buy filters that you can put on the lens that will also do that, but you can also get it from a squinty aperture. It's kind of like if you squint, you know, your eyelashes might blur the light a little bit. You could do that with your eyes. Okay. All right, so that was shutter priority mode. Of course, there's a similar mode for controlling aperture. So shutter priority, and now we have aperture priority. So if you're like, whatever the shutter speed is, I don't care as long as it's not, you know, so slow that I need a tripod. I care about aperture. Then you can operate in aperture priority mode. So I sometimes think of these modes as, I don't know, I don't want to say like training wheels, because for some reason that sounds childish or something, I guess, but it's just less to think about. You can focus on what you want and not worry about, oh, now I've adjusted the shutter speed. What do I have to do to my aperture to make this balance? You just pick your aperture and go, or your shutter speed and go. So aperture priority is the same thing, lets you control your aperture. So in a scene like this, I care about the aperture because I get this yummy blur behind it. I don't really care what the shutter speed or the ISO are doing unless they're causing a problem. That's about it. So it's just a convenient, nice thing. And I will point out, because I don't think I have a slide to show you, but in those two modes, just like we talked about when we went through the exposure and I showed you, like, here's how you change your shutter speed, here's how you change your aperture. When you're in these priority modes, many cameras, the DSLRs, that same dial will do one or the other. So the dial that's near the shutter release, when you're in shutter priority mode, it controls your shutter speed. When you're in aperture priority mode, it controls your aperture. So you only have to do that push the button and hold it and turn the dial if you're in manual mode, just as a little note. Okay, so that's how that works. So you can be in one of those modes, turn your little dial, pick your setting, and you're off.